Okay, in the last segment, we looked at the how to use this VRIO framework for assessing whether or not a resource or capability would lead to sustainable competitive advantage. So whether it was valuable, rare, inimitable, and whether or not the firm was organized in their other processes and other, resources to be able to get the most out of that particular resource and apply it for strategic competitive advantage. Well, just to look at it in a bit more detail, if you remember on an earlier slide, we categorized various resources as tangible, intangible, and human resources. Well, now we can also then look at their various characteristics and then show indicators or ways of measuring that particular resource, and then use the VRIO framework to determine whether or not it's going to lead to a sustainable competitive advantage. So, for example, with tangible resources, we can say, well, financial, physical resources. For financial resources, we can look at borrowing capacity, internal funds, or the generation of internal funds. And for an indicator, we can look at, stock market performance indicators, ratios like debt to equity. We can look at credit rating. We can look at the net cash flow. For physical resources, things like plant and equipment, the size, the location, the level of technology or flexibility, the land and buildings and raw materials, and we can just look at things like the market value of fixed assets, the scale or the capacity of plants, or the various alternatives for fixed assets. If we look at intangible resources, we can look in terms of technology like patents, copyrights, internal know-how, R&D facilities, the technical and scientific employees. As indicators or measures of these things, we can look at the number of patents owned, the income coming from royalties, the R&D expenditure, the number of R&D staff. For reputation measures, for reputation characteristics, we can see like things like brands, customer loyalty, company reputation. And we can look at measures like brand equity measures or the price premium that we're gaining, like the price that we can gain above and beyond other competitors or unbranded versions of our product. We can look at things like brand awareness or brand recognition. For human resources, in terms of training, experience, adaptability, commitment, and loyalty of customers, we can look at measures like employee qualifications, the pay rates, or the turnover rates. So all these, resources and capabilities, we can look at very specifically, look at, indicators of those or measures, objective measurement of those things, and then we can determine, how valuable, how rare, how inimitable, and how well organized we are. And then in that way we can determine their importance for gaining sustainable competitive advantage. Now I'm going to go through an example using Volkswagen's resources and capabilities, and I'll show you a way of, again, like a framework for organizing this understanding. And it'll look similar to you, this framework. It kind of looks a bit similar to a perceptual map. If you remember using perceptual mapping in marketing for seeing how brands are related to each other in terms of the consumer's choice criteria, well, here we'll look at the resources and capabilities in terms of how strong they are, in terms of our strength on those resources and capabilities compared to competitors, and also in terms of their importance, like how important these resources and capabilities are for generating this, sustainable competitive advantage. It'll become more clear when we look at it. So we can say that, on one side we'll have the resources, we'll have their importance, and then they'll have their relative strength. So the resources for Volkswagen are finance, technology, plant and equipment, location, dealer networks, and brands. Then we can, look at their importance, that is, how important in terms of perhaps using this, we can use a VRIO framework in kind of evaluating their importance on a scale of 1 to 10. So plant and equipment and dealer networks are the most important for Volkswagen to get competitive advantage out of those particular resources. Volkswagen's relative strength versus competitors, it looks like plant and equipment is its highest relative strength, but there are some, weaknesses as well, especially dealer networks. If you look at that, it's considered to be very important, but they score only a 5 out of 10 in terms of relative strength. In terms of capabilities, we have product development, purchasing, engineering, manufacturing, financial management, R&D, marketing and sales, and strategic management. Among those, the two most important are product development and marketing and sales, manufacturing coming in and strategic management coming in, close second. In terms of relative strength, it looks like Volkswagen is relatively weak across the board, except in terms of engineering. So they've got, in terms of important, weaknesses, we can say, in terms of product development, marketing, and sales, they're weak, even weak on those important attributes or capabilities. So, you should write, if you can, at this point, just write down these, numbers. R1 is 6 and 6. R2, technology is 7 and 5. Write down these numbers, or actually we'll go back. You can flip back on the slide but for the next part, what we're going to do is we'll make a matrix, and this is the thing that looks like a perceptual map, but on one side we'll have relative strength, and on the other side we'll have strategic importance, so from 1 to 10 and from 1 to 10, and then we can divide it into 4 quadrants. The first quadrant we'll call the zone of irrelevance, that is, from 1 to 5 on relative strength and 1 to 5 on strategic importance. We can see that these resources and capabilities are low in importance, and they're also not among our strongest points. In fact, we're relatively weak on them. So these are things that we're weak on, but they're not very important anyway. Then if we move upward, we see that we're strong on these points, but these are not strategically important points. So we can call these superfluous strengths, that is, kind of meaningless strengths, not important strengths. Then our key strengths are, things that we're important on, characteristics or, resources and capabilities that are, that we are good at, that we're strong at, but they're also strategically important. And then we've got key weaknesses. So these are things that are relatively, very important, but that we're relatively weak on. So this kind of looks almost a bit like a SWOT analysis in terms of strengths and weaknesses, right? But it's an improvement over a SWOT analysis. In which ways do you think? Like, how is this an improvement over a SWOT analysis? It outlines the strengths and weaknesses, right? And these are our key strengths and key weaknesses. But it goes beyond the SWOT analysis in that it says, which of these are strategically important strengths and weaknesses. So we can determine key strengths and key weaknesses, those that are very, important to us to determine or to achieve a sustainable competitive advantage. So this is good if you're consulting, you can use this for consulting, but it's also good for just internal analysis for the company, right? We're trying to determine as a basis of strategy, what is our capabilities, what are our capabilities and our resources, and which ones of these are really important to us, and which ones are we very strong at, and which ones are important and that we're weak at. It also, and it goes beyond a kind of SWOT analysis in that it quantifies these strengths and weaknesses, right? It quantifies them on a scale of 1 to 10, and for strategic importance and for relative strength. So let's look at how Volkswagen turned out, and you can see that the key strengths are capability 3 and resource 3. Now I forget off the top of my head, you were supposed to write those down, what those are. The key weaknesses are C1 and C7. So we've got one, superfluous strength R4, and we've got almost an irrelevant weakness C6. But our key strengths are C3 and R3. What was that? C3 was engineering, and R3 was plant and equipment. Key weaknesses were C1 and C7. Product development, you can see it's very important, but our strength, Volkswagen's strength was a 4. And C7, marketing and sales, extremely important, of course, but relative strength was low. So these are things that we need to pay attention to. So how do we now, let's summarize this, how can we apply this resource-based view to strategy? First of all, we need to identify the firm's resources and capabilities. And we looked at two ways of identifying them. We looked at a functional approach, where we looked at the various functions like marketing, finance, sales, HR, etc. But we said, that's not maybe the best. We can do better by looking at these generic value chains. And especially Porter's generic value chain allowed us to kind of see the, value adding function or value adding capabilities and processes and activities that the firms do, right? We had this primary activities that add value. So we identify those. Then we, explore the linkages between the resources and capabilities in terms of their organization, in terms of their processes, their sub-processes, their components. And then we evaluate the firm's resources and capabilities in terms of the strategic importance and the relative strength, that is, the ability for them to provide sustainable competitive advantage. And we gave a framework, this VRIO framework, right, to evaluate the strategic importance and the relative strength. And then we developed strategy implications. Now, how can the strengths be exploited more effectively and fully? How can we play to our strengths? So give emphasis to the ones that we're good at, and also deploy them, that is, put them into place in a timely way, and organize the firm to be able to exploit them, right? We need to organize all the other activities and functions. And how can weaknesses be overcome? Identify opportunities to outsource them, right? So if we don't have those capabilities internally, sometimes we can just outsource them. We can also acquire them by hiring new people, or by by buying a company that can do those activities in the value chain, perhaps. We can try to negate them or reduce the impact of those weaknesses, but it's not so easy. It's, we don't want to get into kind of a wishful thinking. And we can try to develop the resources and capabilities internally, in-house, but that's also not so easy. It takes time to develop these capabilities. So that's the end of the lecture. You can go through. If you have any questions, just send me an email, and hopefully we'll get back together real soon. Thank you.